The moment nobody looked at me anymore should have been the moment I realized the day was no longer mine. I had dreamed about that baby shower for nearly 3 years. Not because I cared about decorations or party games or matching gift bags. I dreamed about it because for a long time I was not sure I would ever get there. There had been doctor appointments, disappointments, long stretches of waiting, quiet tears I never told anyone about. So when I finally reached my 7th month of pregnancy, every little detail felt meaningful. The shower was not just a party. It was a celebration of hope finally becoming real. My husband Ethan understood that. He had watched every step of the journey beside me. When my sister offered to host the baby shower at her beautiful suburban home outside Denver, I cried the moment she asked. It felt like the universe was finally giving us something joyful. The morning of the shower was perfect. Bright sunshine reflected off patches of snow still sitting on the lawns. The air was crisp and cold. Inside the house, everything looked exactly how I imagined it. Soft blue and cream decorations filled the living room. Fresh flowers sat on every table. Tiny baby shoes and teddy bear centerpieces decorated the gift tables. Friends and relatives arrived carrying wrapped presents and warm smiles. For the first hour, I felt completely surrounded by love. Women I had known for years hugged me and asked about the baby. Older relatives shared stories about motherhood. Friends laughed as they guessed the baby's birth date during one of the games. Every conversation seemed to circle back to excitement about the little boy Ethan and I were about to welcome into the world. For once I allowed myself to relax. Then Diane arrived. My mother-in-law was never the type of woman who entered a room quietly. At 63, she carried herself with confidence that naturally drew attention. Normally I admired that quality. She always looked polished. Always knew exactly what to say. Always seemed comfortable being the center of a conversation. That afternoon she arrived nearly 40 minutes late. The front door opened and several people immediately turned toward her. Diane stepped inside wearing a striking red winter dress and carrying an expensive gift basket large enough to require both hands. She apologized for being late before launching into a story about terrible traffic that somehow lasted almost 10 minutes. Guests laughed politely. Several people gathered around her. I did not think much of it at first. People were simply being friendly. Yet something felt different. While I stood beside the dessert table speaking with a cousin, I noticed more guests drifting toward Diane. She moved through the room greeting people one by one. Within minutes, she had gathered a small crowd. Again, nothing unusual. At least not yet. But then I began noticing little things. When someone asked how I was feeling, Diane answered before I could. When another guest asked about nursery colors, Diane launched into a long explanation about decorating Ethan's nursery when he was a baby. During a game designed around predicting details about my son, Diane somehow became the person telling most of the stories. Nobody appeared bothered. In fact, most people seemed entertained. I kept smiling. I kept thanking guests for coming. I kept reminding myself that this was a family celebration and everyone was simply having fun. Yet each time I looked around the room, the focus seemed to shift a little farther away from me. Ethan had stepped outside briefly to help unload extra folding chairs from a neighbor's truck. My sister was busy organizing refreshments. Nobody else seemed to notice what I was feeling. Around 2 o'clock, everyone gathered in the living room for presents. This was the part one had been most excited about. Not because of gifts, because it was the first moment where everyone would sit together and celebrate the baby. As guests found seats, I settled into a decorated chair placed near the fireplace. Then Diane stood up unexpectedly. She tapped her glass gently with a spoon. Conversations stopped. Every face turned toward her. She smiled warmly and looked around the room. "Before Olivia opens anything," she said, "there is something very special I would like to share with all of you." The room fell silent, and somehow, without understanding why, I suddenly felt a knot form in my stomach. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Diane. The cheerful chatter that had filled the house moments earlier disappeared almost instantly. I sat in the decorated chair near the fireplace with my hands resting gently on my stomach, waiting to hear what she thought was important enough to interrupt the gift opening. Diane smiled as if she were about to deliver wonderful news. "First," she began, "I just want to say how excited I am to become a grandmother." Several guests nodded and smiled politely. I relaxed slightly. That seemed harmless enough. Then she continued. This baby means more to me than I can possibly explain. Again, nothing unusual. Yet something about the way she emphasized herself caught my attention. She spoke for several minutes, telling stories about Ethan as a baby. She described his first steps, his favorite toys, and the challenges she faced raising him. Guests laughed at the appropriate moments. A few even wiped away tears during some of the more emotional memories. I tried to remain supportive. After all, becoming a grandmother was meaningful for her too. But as the speech continued, I noticed something strange. The baby shower slowly stopped feeling like a celebration for a future child, and began feeling like a tribute to Diane's experiences as a mother. Every story circled back to her. Every emotional moment centered around her memories. Every laugh belonged to her anecdotes. By the time she finally finished, nearly 15 minutes had passed. People applauded warmly. Then several guests immediately began asking Diane questions about raising children. I watched as conversations shifted once again. Someone asked her for parenting advice. Another guest wanted to hear more stories about Ethan growing up. Soon a small crowd had gathered around her chair. Meanwhile, the wrapped gifts waiting beside me sat untouched. My sister eventually clapped her hands and announced it was time to begin opening presents. Everyone returned to their seats, but the energy in the room felt different now. As I opened the first gift, a beautiful handmade baby blanket, I started thanking the friend who had brought it. Before I finished speaking, Diane leaned forward. That reminds me of a blanket I made for Ethan when he was born. Several people turned toward her immediately. She launched into another story. The attention shifted again. I smiled politely and waited for the story to end. Then I opened another gift. A tiny set of baby clothes. Those are adorable, someone said. Before I could respond, Diane laughed. Ethan had an outfit almost exactly like that. Another story followed. Then another. Then another. Each interruption seemed small. Harmless even. Yet by the fourth or fifth time I started noticing a pattern. Every moment somehow redirected attention back toward Diane. The gifts became opportunities for her memories. My pregnancy became a gateway into discussions about her motherhood. The future baby became a reason to revisit her past. Nobody appeared offended. In fact, many guests seemed genuinely interested. That was what made the situation so difficult. Nothing she was doing looked openly rude. Nothing sounded cruel. If anything, she appeared enthusiastic and loving. Yet I could not shake the growing feeling that I was fading into the background of my own celebration. At one point, a close friend asked me whether Ethan and I had finalized the baby's name. I opened my mouth to answer. Before I could speak, Diane smiled broadly. I have been hoping they choose something traditional. Several guests immediately began discussing baby names with her instead. I sat there quietly while a conversation about my child unfolded without me. Ethan finally returned inside after helping with the chairs. He immediately noticed the crowded room and festive atmosphere. Smiling, he walked over and kissed my forehead. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. I forced a smile. Of course. I did not want to create tension. Not today. Not here. He squeezed my shoulder and moved toward the kitchen to help refill drinks. The afternoon continued. More gifts. More stories. More moments slipping away. Then something happened that made the uneasy feeling in my stomach grow stronger. While guests were enjoying refreshments, I overheard two women speaking near the dining room. One of them laughed and said, "Diane really knows how to command a room." The other smiled and replied, "Honestly, it feels like we are celebrating her as much as the baby." They both chuckled before moving on to another topic. The comment was meant as a joke, yet it lingered in my mind, because for the first time all afternoon someone else had noticed it too. I looked across the room toward Diane. She stood surrounded by relatives, smiling as she shared another story. And as I watched the group hanging on her every word, I realized something that left me strangely unsettled. The day was slowly changing shape, and I was beginning to wonder whether that had been her intention all along. By late afternoon, the house was still full of laughter, conversation, and the soft sounds of a celebration that looked perfect from the outside. Guests moved between the living room and dining area carrying plates of food and cups of coffee. Children played quietly in a corner while older relatives shared stories around the fireplace. Anyone walking through the front door would have assumed the day was unfolding exactly as planned. The truth felt very different from where I was sitting. The small moments continued piling up. None of them were dramatic enough to attract attention. That was what made them so difficult to explain. Every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, another moment arrived. When my sister announced it was time for guests to write advice cards for the baby, Diane immediately gathered a group around the table and began giving instructions. Technically, she was helping. Yet somehow she became the center of an activity she had not organized. Later, when guests were invited to guess the baby's birth weight, Diane spent nearly 10 minutes explaining how accurately she had predicted Ethan's weight before he was born. People listened politely. Some even laughed. Once again, the focus drifted toward her. I tried to stay positive. Pregnancy had already taught me that not everything unfolds exactly as expected. Maybe I was simply feeling emotional. Maybe I was being overly sensitive because this child meant so much to me. I repeated those thoughts several times throughout the afternoon. Unfortunately, each new interaction made them harder to believe. At one point, a family friend approached me holding a wrapped gift. "Olivia, this one is from my daughter," she said warmly. "She could not make it today, but she wanted you to have it." Before I could thank her, Diane stepped forward. "That reminds me," she said. "I brought some old baby items from Ethan's childhood that I think should stay in the family." Several people immediately turned toward her. She began describing a collection of keepsakes she had saved for decades. The conversation shifted again. The woman who had approached me smiled awkwardly and eventually wandered away. I sat there holding the gift she had brought while listening to another discussion that no longer had anything to do with me. Ethan remained busy helping guests throughout the house. Every time I looked at him, he seemed happy, relaxed, proud. He had no idea what I was noticing because none of it appeared serious enough to mention. How was I supposed to explain that the problem was not one event but 100 tiny moments? Even I struggled to put it into words. Then another incident happened. My sister had arranged a display board filled with photographs documenting my pregnancy journey. There were ultrasound pictures, photographs from family gatherings, and snapshots Ethan had taken throughout the previous 7 months. It was one of my favorite parts of the shower. Several guests were gathered around the board admiring the pictures when Diane walked over. Within moments, she began pointing toward old family photos on her phone. "You should see Ethan at that age," she said. Soon the crowd shifted away from the pregnancy display and surrounded Diane as she scrolled through pictures from 30 years earlier. I watched from across the room. Nobody was trying to hurt me. Nobody intended to ignore the display. Yet somehow that was exactly what happened. The board my sister had spent hours creating stood nearly abandoned, while a new audience formed around Diane's stories. The longer the afternoon continued, the more invisible I felt. Not completely invisible, just slightly less visible with every passing hour. Around 4 o'clock, I stepped into the kitchen for a few minutes of quiet. My feet ached. My back hurt. More than anything, I needed a break from smiling. As I poured myself a glass of water, my Aunt Linda entered the room. She studied my face for a moment. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. I hesitated. Then I smiled. "Just tired." She nodded slowly. For a second, I thought she might say something else. Instead, she squeezed my hand and returned to the party. Yet her expression stayed with me. It was the look of someone who had noticed more than she was willing to say. A few minutes later, I returned to the living room. As I approached, I heard Diane speaking to a group of guests. "I have already started planning all the traditions I want to share with my grandson," she said proudly. My grandson. The phrase itself was not unusual, but something about the way she said it made me pause. It sounded less like excitement and more like ownership. Then she laughed and added, "Sometimes I feel like I have been waiting for this baby even longer than Olivia has." The group laughed politely. I forced a smile. Yet deep inside, a quiet voice whispered something I could no longer ignore. This was not simply enthusiasm. Something else was happening. And for the first time all day, I began wondering whether Diane had arrived with a plan nobody else could see. The afternoon moved forward, but the feeling in my chest refused to leave. Every time I convinced myself I was overthinking things, another small moment pushed that doubt aside. Diane was not being openly rude. She was not insulting anyone. She was not causing scenes. In many ways, that was what made the situation so confusing. Everything she did could be explained away as excitement. Yet the result remained the same. The attention kept drifting toward her and away from the reason we were all gathered there in the first place. Around 5 o'clock, my sister announced one final activity before dessert. She had prepared a memory book where guests could write messages for the baby to read someday. The idea was simple and heartfelt. Family members would leave advice, wishes, and little stories that our son could enjoy when he was older. Guests immediately loved the idea. Several people lined up to write entries. For the first few minutes, things finally felt normal again. People asked me questions about the nursery. They talked about the baby. They shared excitement about the future. I began to relax. Then Diane stood up carrying the large gift basket she had brought earlier. "Actually," she said with a smile, "before we finish today, I have something special I would like everyone to see." Conversation stopped immediately. Once again, the room turned toward her. My stomach tightened. Diane placed the basket on the dining room table and carefully removed several framed photographs. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I realized they were pictures of Ethan throughout his childhood. Baby photos, school portraits, holiday pictures, sports team photographs. More and more images appeared until nearly the entire table was covered. Guests gathered around immediately. Diane smiled proudly. "I thought it would be fun to take a walk through memory lane before the next generation arrives." People laughed and moved closer. Within minutes, the baby shower transformed into an informal exhibit dedicated to Ethan's childhood. Relatives shared memories. Friends asked questions. Stories filled the room. The memory book sat forgotten in a corner. I stood quietly beside the fireplace watching the scene unfold. Even Ethan looked surprised. He walked over to the table and picked up one of the photographs. "Mom, where did you even find these?" he asked. Diane beamed. "I spent weeks organizing them." Weeks. The word immediately caught my attention. I looked at her. She had spent weeks preparing this. Weeks gathering photographs, arranging frames, and planning a presentation that would inevitably become a focal point of the event. The realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. This was not spontaneous. This was intentional. My Aunt Linda appeared beside me again. She studied the crowded table for several seconds. Then she quietly asked, "Did you know she was planning this?" I shook my head. Linda's expression changed ever so slightly. Not shock. Concern. Before either of us could say more, Diane lifted a glass and tapped it gently with a spoon. The room grew quiet once again. "I just want to say something," she announced. Guests turned toward her. She smiled warmly. "Everyone here knows how excited we are about this baby. But today also reminds me how quickly time passes." She picked up a photograph of Ethan as a toddler. "It feels like yesterday that I was holding him for the first time." Several guests nodded emotionally. Then Diane reached into her purse and removed a small envelope. My pulse quickened. Something about the gesture felt rehearsed, carefully planned. She opened the envelope and removed several printed pages. "I wanted to share something very personal," she said. "A letter I wrote years ago when Ethan was born." The room fell completely silent. Guests leaned forward. Diane began reading. The letter described her experience as a new mother. Her hopes. Her fears. Her dreams for her child. It was beautifully written. Emotional. Genuine. By the time she finished, several people had tears in their eyes. A few even applauded softly. Then someone stood and hugged her. Another guest followed. Soon people were gathering around Diane once again, praising her words and thanking her for sharing such a meaningful memory. I looked around the room. The photographs. The stories. The letter. The conversations. Somehow the entire event had shifted completely away from the baby, away from the future, and back toward Diane's past. As guests surrounded her, I noticed my sister standing near the kitchen doorway. Her expression mirrored exactly what I had been feeling all afternoon. She had finally noticed it too. And when our eyes met across the room, she gave the smallest shake of her head. In that moment, I knew I was not imagining any of it anymore. For the next half hour, I moved through the remainder of the gathering with a smile that felt increasingly difficult to maintain. Guests continued complimenting Diane on the photographs and the letter she had shared. Several relatives thanked her for bringing such meaningful memories. Others gathered around the display table asking questions about Ethan's childhood. The baby shower decorations still filled the room. Wrapped gifts still sat near the fireplace. The memory book remained open on a side table. Yet somehow all of those things now felt secondary. The atmosphere had shifted so gradually that most people probably never realized it had happened. My sister certainly noticed. Every time our eyes met across the room, I could tell she was trying to understand exactly what she was seeing. Around 6 o'clock, guests began helping themselves to dessert. Plates of cake and cookies appeared throughout the house. The room grew louder as conversations resumed. For the first time all afternoon, I stepped outside onto the back patio for a moment of quiet. The winter air felt cold against my face. Snow still covered parts of the yard. I stood there looking across the neighborhood, trying to calm the mixture of disappointment and confusion swirling inside me. A few moments later, I heard the sliding door open behind me. It was Aunt Linda. She stepped outside carrying 2 cups of hot tea and handed one to me. "I thought you might need this," she said gently. I smiled. "Thank you." For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then Linda leaned against the railing and looked through the glass doors toward the party inside. "You know," she said carefully, "I almost called you 3 weeks ago." I frowned. "About what?" Linda hesitated. Something that seemed strange at the time. My attention sharpened immediately. She took a slow breath. "Diane called me." I waited. She asked if I had any photographs of Ethan from when he was young. She wanted copies. That alone was not surprising. "For today's display?" I asked. Linda nodded. "At the time, that is what she told me." She looked back toward the living room. But then she said something odd. A knot formed in my stomach. "What did she say?" Linda lowered her voice. "She laughed and told me this baby shower was the perfect opportunity to remind everyone where this family started." The words landed heavily between us. "Ist daher." "Are you sure?" Linda nodded. I remember because it struck me as an unusual thing to say. She took a sip of tea. I assumed she meant celebrating family history. For several seconds I said nothing. Suddenly, many of the day's events looked different. The photographs, the stories, the letter, the constant redirection of attention. One by one, the pieces began fitting together. Linda studied my expression. "Olivia, I hope I am wrong." "No," I said quietly. "I do not think you are." Through the glass doors I could see Diane standing in the center of another conversation. Guests laughed at something she had just said. Once again she occupied the focal point of the room. Linda followed my gaze. "There is something else." My heart sank. "What?" "A few days ago I stopped by Diane's house." She paused. She showed me a scrapbook she was making. I looked at her. "A scrapbook?" Linda nodded. Pictures from today's event were already planned. She had pages prepared. I felt my stomach tighten further. How is that possible? Because she told me she knew exactly what she wanted today's story to be. Story. The word echoed in my mind. Linda continued carefully. She said this was going to be the beginning of her grandmother chapter. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The realization was becoming impossible to ignore. This was not simply enthusiasm. This was not a series of innocent interruptions. Diane had been planning something. Maybe not with malicious intentions. Maybe not to hurt me. But certainly to place herself at the center of a milestone that was supposed to belong to someone else. The sliding door opened again. This time it was Ethan. "There you are," he said with a smile. "Everyone is looking for you." I forced a pleasant expression. I just needed some air. Ethan stepped beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Mom has everybody telling old family stories in there." He laughed softly. "You should hear some of them." Linda and I exchanged a brief glance. Ethan did not notice. He still saw the afternoon as a happy family gathering. He had no idea that an entirely different picture was beginning to emerge. As we headed back inside, I looked once more toward Diane. She stood beneath a banner meant to celebrate the coming arrival of our son. Yet somehow she had positioned herself directly beneath it. surrounded by smiling guests and old photographs. And for the first time all day, I stopped wondering whether this had been intentional. The evidence was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. When we walked back into the house, the atmosphere felt different to me even though nothing visible had changed. The decorations were still beautiful. Guests were still smiling. The scent of coffee and vanilla cake still drifted through the living room. Yet now I carried information I had not possessed an hour earlier. Aunt Linda's comments echoed repeatedly in my mind. The photographs had been planned weeks in advance. The stories had been prepared. The letter had not been a spontaneous emotional moment. It had been part of something larger. I found myself watching Diane more carefully than before. Not with anger, with curiosity. For the first time, I wanted to understand how much of the afternoon had been intentional. Ethan remained completely unaware. He moved from group to group thanking guests for coming and helping clear empty plates. Every so often he would stop beside me and ask if I needed anything. I always gave the same answer. No, I am fine. The truth was more complicated. I was not fine, but I was also not ready to explain why. Around 6:30, my sister announced one final group activity before people began heading home. She wanted everyone to gather for photographs. Guests immediately started arranging themselves throughout the living room. Small family groups formed near the fireplace and Christmas decorations. Couples posed together. Friends laughed as they squeezed into pictures. For a few minutes, the mood felt light again. Then something happened that finally caught Ethan's attention. My sister called out, "Olivia, come over here. We need a picture of the parents-to-be." Ethan immediately walked toward me. Before either of us reached the designated spot, Diane stepped directly between us carrying one of the framed childhood photographs. "Wait," she said cheerfully. "We should do one with 3 generations first." Nobody objected. It sounded reasonable. Ethan stood beside Diane while a photographer snapped several pictures. Then another set. Then another. More relatives joined. More photos followed. Nearly 10 minutes passed before anyone returned to the original plan. I noticed Ethan glancing toward me during the process. Not because he was upset. Because for the first time he seemed to realize something unusual had happened. The moment passed quickly, but I saw it. A question forming. Later, as guests prepared to leave, another opportunity arrived. A family friend approached carrying a large gift wrapped in blue paper. "This one is specifically for Olivia," she said with a smile. "I wanted her to open it before I go." I thanked her warmly. Several nearby guests gathered around. Finally, I thought, a simple moment focused on the baby. I began opening the package. Halfway through removing the wrapping paper, Diane suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, that reminds me." She hurried toward her purse and pulled out several more photographs she claimed she had forgotten to share. Within seconds, attention shifted again. Not completely. Just enough. The friend who had brought the gift looked confused. Ethan looked confused too. His eyes moved from me to Diane and back again. For the first time all day, he did not immediately join the conversation Diane had created. Instead, he stayed where he was. Watching. Observing. Connecting. The realization did not arrive all at once. I could see that. Came gradually. The same way it had happened for me. One small moment meant nothing. 2 small moments seemed coincidental. 20 small moments began forming a pattern. As the evening progressed, Ethan became quieter. He still smiled. Still thanked guests. Still helped clean up. Yet he spent more time observing than participating. Several times, I caught him looking around the room with a thoughtful expression. Once, he noticed the memory book sitting nearly untouched on a side table. Another time, he paused beside the pregnancy photo display that had been ignored for most of the afternoon. His eyes lingered there longer than before. Eventually, only close family remained. The house felt calmer. My sister was carrying empty serving trays into the kitchen when Ethan quietly approached her. Happened to be nearby folding tissue paper from gifts. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She nodded. Ethan lowered his voice. "Has Mom seemed a little different today?" My sister hesitated. "Just long enough." "What do you mean?" Ethan looked toward the living room where Diane was sharing another story with relatives. "I do not know exactly." He paused. "It just feels like every road somehow leads back to her." My sister studied him carefully. Then she glanced toward me. Neither of them realized I could hear. You noticed that too? She asked softly. Ethan frowned. Too. The single word changed everything. Because in that moment, I knew he was finally starting to see what the rest of us had been witnessing all afternoon. The pattern was no longer invisible. And once someone notices a pattern, it becomes very difficult to stop seeing it. By 7 o'clock, most of the guests had left. The house felt noticeably quieter. Wrapping paper had been gathered into bags. Empty dessert plates sat stacked on the kitchen counter. The baby shower was technically over, yet a handful of close relatives remained in the living room finishing coffee and conversation. Diane still occupied the center of one of those conversations. She sat comfortably in an armchair surrounded by family members, listening to stories about Ethan's childhood. Under different circumstances, the scene might have looked perfectly normal. After all, families enjoy reminiscing. Grandparents enjoy sharing memories. Nothing about the image itself seemed unusual. The problem was everything that had happened before it. Ethan had become increasingly quiet during the last hour. He was not angry. He was thinking. Every so often I noticed his eyes moving around the room, replaying moments from earlier in the day. The interrupted gift opening. The speech. The photographs. The letter. The repeated shifts in attention. For the first time, he was seeing the entire sequence rather than isolated events. My sister walked into the living room carrying a storage box. I should probably start packing some of these decorations, she said. Several relatives offered to help. Soon people began collecting centerpieces and folding extra chairs. As they worked, one of Diane's framed photo displays was accidentally knocked sideways. A stack of papers slid from behind the frame and scattered across the coffee table. Oops, someone laughed. Diane immediately leaned forward. Careful with those. She sounded more concerned than seemed necessary. Ethan reached down to help gather the papers. At first, he appeared to think they were additional photographs. Then he paused. One of the pages had writing on it. His eyes narrowed slightly. What is this? He asked. Diane stood up quickly. Nothing important. The response came too fast. Too rehearsed. Ethan looked at the page again. It looks like notes. Diane extended her hand. Just give those to me. Instead, Ethan glanced down and began reading. The room grew quiet. Nobody planned it. Simply happened. One by one, conversations stopped. Ethan turned over another page. Then another. His expression changed. Mom, he said slowly. What exactly is this? Diane hesitated. For the first time all day, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. My Aunt Linda leaned forward from the sofa. Curious relatives moved closer. Ethan continued reading. The papers were not photographs. They were planning notes. Typed pages. Handwritten reminders. Lists. Dates. Names. Under ordinary circumstances, none of it would have mattered. Except for one section near the top of the first page. Ethan read it aloud without meaning to. Make sure the memory display is revealed before gift opening becomes the main focus. Silence filled the room. Nobody spoke. Ethan looked up. Then back down. Another line appeared farther below. Bring letter from Ethan's baby book. Emotional moment. He flipped the page. Share childhood photos after guests settle in. Another page contained a checklist. Several items had check marks beside them. Memory display. Letter. Family stories. 3-generation photos. Each one completed. Each one prepared in advance. My pulse quickened. Across the room, my sister slowly sat down. Aunt Linda closed her eyes briefly. The evidence was sitting in plain sight. Not malicious. Not cruel. But undeniably intentional. Ethan looked at his mother. You planned all of this. Diane opened her mouth. Closed it. Then finally nodded. I wanted the day to feel special. Ethan glanced toward me. Then back toward the pages. Mom, this was Olivia's baby shower. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The words carried enough weight on their own. Diane looked around the room as if searching for support. Instead, she found thoughtful faces. Concerned faces. Confused faces. My Aunt Linda finally spoke. Diane, why did you need a checklist for your own stories? The question hung in the air. Diane sat down slowly. For several seconds, she simply stared at the papers scattered across the table. Then she whispered something so quietly that everyone leaned forward to hear it. Because I was afraid nobody would remember where this family came from. The room remained silent. Yet the statement did not create the effect she expected. Instead of answering the question, it revealed something much deeper. And judging by the look on Ethan's face, he understood that immediately. The story was no longer about a baby shower. It was about something Diane had been carrying for a very long time. And for the first time all day, the truth had finally stepped into the open where everyone could see it. The room stayed silent after Diane's confession. Nobody seemed interested in arguing. Nobody appeared angry. If anything, the atmosphere felt unexpectedly sad. The planning notes remained scattered across the coffee table between empty coffee cups and half-finished dessert plates. They were no longer just pieces of paper. They had become a map showing exactly how the day had unfolded. Ethan looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he slowly sat down across from her. "Mom," he said gently, "nobody was forgetting where this family came from." Diane lowered her eyes. For the first time all afternoon she looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. As if maintaining control of the day had required far more effort than anyone realized. "You do not understand," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Then help me understand." Diane folded her hands together. Around the room, relatives listened without interrupting. "Ever since Olivia became pregnant," she began, "everything started changing." Her voice trembled slightly. Everyone talked about the baby, the nursery, the future. She glanced toward me. "And they should have. I know that." She paused. But every conversation made me feel like my chapter was ending. Nobody spoke. Diane looked around the room. "I know how ridiculous that sounds." Aunt Linda shook her head softly. "It does not sound ridiculous." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "When Ethan was little, I was the one everyone called. I organized holidays, planned birthdays, took pictures, remembered traditions." She laughed quietly. "Then suddenly I felt like I was becoming a footnote in my own family." The words settled heavily over the room. For the first time, I began seeing something beneath all the attention-seeking behavior. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of being left behind. Ethan leaned forward. "Mom, becoming a grandmother does not erase being a mother." Diane nodded slowly. "I know that now." Her eyes drifted toward the planning notes. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I did not remind everyone who I was, they would stop noticing me. Nobody judged her. Nobody mocked her. Because beneath the awkwardness of the day, many people understood the feeling she was describing. Families grow. Roles change. New generations arrive. Those transitions are not always easy. My sister finally spoke. The problem was never wanting to be included. Diane looked at her. "Then what was the problem?" My sister's answer came gently. "You tried to make yourself the main character in someone else's milestone." The room fell silent again. Diane closed her eyes briefly. The truth of that statement was impossible to escape. Across from me, Ethan nodded. "Mom, today was supposed to be about Olivia and the baby." Diane wiped at her eyes. "I know." Then she looked directly at me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The room seemed to disappear around us. Finally, she said something I had not expected. "I owe you an apology." Her voice was steady despite the tears. "Not because I wanted attention." She shook her head. "Because I cared more about my fear than your happiness." The honesty caught me off guard. There was no excuse hidden inside her words. No attempt to shift blame. Just accountability. "I spent weeks planning moments that should have belonged to you," she continued. "And I kept telling myself I was helping." She looked down at the notes. "The truth is I was protecting my own feelings." Ethan reached over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Around the room, family members exchanged thoughtful glances. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier, everyone had been trying to understand what happened. Now they understood why. That difference mattered. Understanding did not erase the hurt, but it made healing possible. Aunt Linda smiled softly. "You know something?" Diane looked up. "What?" Linda gestured around the room. Nobody here was ever going to forget you. Several relatives nodded. My sister nodded too. Ethan smiled sadly. You are the reason half our traditions exist. Diane laughed through her tears. Then why did I feel invisible? Ethan answered without hesitation. Because you were looking at what was changing instead of what was staying. Nobody spoke after that. They did not need to. The truth had finally reached the center of the room. Not the truth about photographs or speeches or planning notes. The deeper truth underneath all of it. Diane had not been fighting for attention. She had been fighting against the fear of becoming irrelevant. The tragedy was that in trying to avoid being forgotten, she had nearly overshadowed the very people she loved most. And judging by the expressions around the room, everyone finally understood it. The conversation lingered long after the difficult truths had been spoken. Nobody seemed eager to leave. The decorations still hung throughout the house, but the atmosphere felt entirely different from earlier in the day. The tension that had quietly followed us from room to room was finally gone. In its place was something calmer, honest, human. Diane remained seated for several minutes, looking at the planning notes scattered across the coffee table. Then she slowly reached forward and gathered them into a neat stack. There was something symbolic about the gesture. The carefully orchestrated version of the day she had spent weeks preparing no longer mattered. The performance was over. What remained was real family. Ethan eventually stood and stretched. Then he looked around the room and smiled. You know what? Everyone turned toward him. There is one thing we never actually finished. My sister laughed softly. What is that? Ethan pointed toward the pile of unopened gifts beside the fireplace. For a moment nobody spoke. Then several people laughed. He was right. Somewhere between the speeches, photographs, stories, and revelations, the actual gift opening had never truly been completed. My sister immediately stood up. Then we are fixing that right now. The room suddenly became lighter. Relatives moved chairs closer together again. Coffee cups were set aside. Wrapping paper bags were pulled back into the center of the room. This time, however, something felt different. Nobody was distracted. Nobody was competing for attention. The focus naturally returned to where it had belonged all along. I settled back into the decorated chair near the fireplace. Ethan sat beside me. Family members gathered around. Diane remained seated quietly at first. Then she stood and walked over carrying one final gift. It was smaller than most of the others. Wrapped in simple blue paper. She stopped beside my chair. This one is from me, she said softly. I looked up at her. Her expression carried none of the confidence that had defined the afternoon. Instead, it carried sincerity. I carefully accepted the package and removed the wrapping paper. Inside was a handmade scrapbook. Not the one she had planned around herself. A different one. The first page contained a simple photograph of Ethan and me standing together shortly after we learned we were expecting. Beneath it, she had written a single sentence. Every family story grows because someone chooses to make room for the next chapter. I stared at the page for several seconds. Around the room, family members quietly looked over my shoulder. Diane swallowed hard before speaking. I started making it a few weeks ago. Her voice trembled slightly. Originally, it was supposed to be something very different. She glanced at the planning notes. Now it is exactly what it should have been from the beginning. I slowly turned the pages. There were photographs from the pregnancy, notes from relatives, messages for the baby, family memories connected directly to the future rather than the past. Tears filled my eyes, not because of the scrapbook itself, because of what it represented. Growth, understanding, a willingness to change. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way I had hoped the day would feel from the start. Gifts were opened. Stories were shared. Laughter filled the room. People talked about the baby. They talked about the future. They talked about becoming grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Nobody disappeared. Nobody was forgotten. Everyone belonged. Before the last relatives left, my sister insisted on taking one final group photograph. This time there were no speeches. No interruptions. No competing moments. Family members simply gathered together near the fireplace. Ethan stood beside me. Diane stood on my other side. Relatives filled the room behind us. The camera timer flashed. The photograph captured smiling faces, warm lights, and a family that looked completely ordinary. Yet I knew better. What that picture truly captured was something far more valuable. It captured a family choosing honesty over pride, understanding over resentment, connection over attention. Months later, after our son was born, that photograph sat framed on a shelf in our living room. Visitors often admired it. They saw a happy family celebrating the arrival of a child. They did not see the lessons hidden inside it. They did not know about the planning notes, the awkward conversations, or the fears that had nearly taken center stage. But every time I looked at that photograph, I remembered something important. Families do not stay strong because people never make mistakes. Families stay strong because people are willing to recognize those mistakes, tell the truth, and make room for one another again. As I held my newborn son a few months later and looked at that picture across the room, I smiled. The baby shower had not unfolded the way I expected. In many ways, it had become something more meaningful. It reminded all of us that love is not about being the center of the story. It is about helping the people you love become the center of theirs.